Well, it's a great joy and privilege to be here this morning, and I'm very thankful for Tammy's warm welcome and for the hospitality of the Lunds and for the great joy that it is to be in such a magnificent and beautiful place. Congratulations to all of you for either finding your way here as a vacationer or living here. Surely you've chosen one of the most beautiful places in the world. We're going to have a chance this week and next week to spend some time looking at a book that is perhaps well known, but often it seems to me imprisoned in Sunday school classrooms. It's a text that often feels much more like it's about children's stories, when in fact, what I think it's really portraying is something that's quite adult in its implications. It has meaning for everyone, but I think it's a really challenging book. It's the book of Daniel, and if you have a Bible, let me invite you to turn there. Daniel is a book that comes at a later section of the writing of the Old Testament. There are two great paradigms in the Old Testament. The first, of course, is the paradigm of the Exodus. In the Exodus, you know that Israel, of course, is taken captive by Egypt. They are under the authoritarian rule of Egypt and seeking to do everything possible to get from Egypt to this place that God has promised, namely the Promised Land. And the struggle and the challenge of their life is really what it means to live under that kind of tyrannical rule, for God to raise up, in this case, Moses, and use Moses as the person who is going to ultimately bring God's people out from Egypt through the wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, eventually across the River Jordan and into the Promised Land. That is a long journey, but it's a very straightforward paradigm. Israel is the good guys, Egypt are the bad guys, the good guys need to get away from the bad guys, and eventually that happens as you get to the Promised Land. Now, that sort of paradigm, which is a paradigm that actually has narrated a lot of the European ancestry, at least, of the United States. People who in various ways have felt as though they were leaving a piece of the bad guys behind in order to come to the shores where they hoped the good guys would be found and where the opportunity for Promised Land life would unfold. We just have celebrated the 4th of July, and part of the narrative of the United States history is told through that kind of Exodus lens. It was very deliberately told in that way by Europeans who saw themselves living out a new kind of Exodus, from one place that felt to them oppressive in various forms to a new place where they were going to find some kind of new life. So people got to the shores of New Jersey and they thought this must be the Promised Land, and other people thought, oh, I hope not, and they kept moving. And gradually some people came to Jackson Hole and decided this was really the Promised Land, and other people decided it was California. Eventually other people thought it was Hawaii. It all goes on in this very American kind of way. And there is a great deal of American culture that still has this sense that we are all seeking our Promised Land life. In fact, this converges really with consumer culture, so that now increasingly a sense of God is the one who's going to give us our Promised Land life, defined primarily by culture, baptized in the name of Jesus to give us the things, the place, the circumstances, the happiness, the dwelling that we want. If we have found that Promised Land, then we stay where we are, and if we haven't found the Promised Land, then we move, or we move houses, or we build a bigger house, or we have a greater sense of a call to somehow wanting a bigger and greater Promised Land life. And when life doesn't go the way that we think it should go, then there's a fundamental dissonance that makes us think as though something is really wrong with reality. I thought this was supposed to be the way the story unfolded, and then the story sometimes does not unfold in that way. That creates its own challenges, and we'll come to that at some other stage. But the first great paradigm of the Old Testament is the story of the Exodus. But the second great paradigm of the Old Testament is really the paradigm of the exile. This is frankly a much more complicated story. Here, God does eventually bring his people to the Promised Land. Not only does he bring them there, but he gives them the land. He establishes a king. He provides at their request and begging a temple, gives them a sacrificial system which fulfills their sense of religious obligation and duty. And it's in the context of that that Israel prides itself in its worship. They believe they know the one true and living God, and all of the competing gods and godlings of the world that's around them are something that they can put to the side because they're assured that they have their worship right. So it is a shock when God begins to send prophetic voices who come to Israel and say more or less century by century, beginning at roughly the 7th century on, I hate your worship. This is not at all what Israel wanted to hear. In fact, they decided it must be that the prophets had it wrong. And yet prophet after prophet came with basically the same message. I hate your worship because what you say about how you live is not actually how you live in the real world. You say that you want to seek me, but the life that you live is really largely about yourselves. It's not really about me. Israel says, no, just give us more of what we want. God says, no, I want you to give more of who you are to me so that your life begins to look like my life. Well, generation upon generation of prophet comes and goes, and yet Israel resists God's desire to change them spiritually. And so ultimately, the spiritual discipline that God sends is known as the exile. Babylon comes and conquers Israel, and now they are set out from the land, no longer occupiers of the land that God had promised. The temple is desecrated. The priests and the priestly system are gone. The people are put out of the land, and now they are called to live as strangers in a strange land under a new kind of religious regime, but also very much under a new kind of political regime as well. And in that circumstance, now the question that God asks his people is this: will you live as faithful exiles? Do you only pursue me because of the blessings that you believe I've given? Or do you pursue me and live like me because I deserve your worship? This is the great challenge in the whole exilic literature and this season that goes on for a long time in Israel's life. The book of Daniel is written as a book to try to give us a portrait of what it means to live as a faithful exile. I think the case can be made that while the Exodus paradigm is a big paradigm that Jesus picks up and will ultimately say will be one day eternally fulfilled, I think the paradigm that may say as much or more to us about the time that we live in right now, even here in the United States, is that the church, I think, is living in a period much more like an exilic period rather than a promised land period. We are called now, I think, to discover what it means to live as strangers in a strange land. What does it mean to acknowledge that we are in some deep sense displaced, and in that context called to exemplify and live out a faithfulness that isn't in the easier life of promised land living, but in the gritty challenges of being strangers in a strange land? The text in the book of Daniel begins in this way. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. And these he brought to the land of Shinar and placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods. It's amazing how such total destruction can be summarized in 2 verses. It was the expungement of Israel's life. The temple was destroyed, their ritual life destroyed. All of the holy implements that were the sign that they were a promised land people, that they had been in the covenant of God, that God had set them aside to be a holy people, were now put in the pagan temples of Nebuchadnezzar underneath this raging, crazy man of who was ruling over Babylonia at the time. Then the text goes on. Then the king commanded his palace master Ashpenaz to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine, and they were to be educated for 3 years, so that at the end of that time they could be stationed in the king's court. Among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. And the palace master gave them new names. Daniel he called Belshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. What's happening in this section of the text is really a sort of classic assimilationist strategy. The conqueror comes and takes over control, but ultimately the success of that conquering force depends on assimilation. And the strategy of assimilation was often to take the best and the brightest, assimilate them into this new culture, and over time that will lead them into a context in which they will be able to be instruments of further assimilation of their people. This is exactly what was happening. Daniel and his friends are taken into Nebuchadnezzar's own house. They're given the rations of food that would be part of the king's own table. They were given new names, new language, new literature. They were to be instructed for 3 years. All of this is to take seriously the task of assimilation. Give them the best course with the best teachers and the most exclusive and controlling set of forces in order that at the end of that, they will be able to be servants in Nebuchadnezzar's own house and be agents of that kind of assimilation that Nebuchadnezzar now wants to bring about in all of Israel. It's in that context that now the question then becomes, how will they remember who they are? They were God's people, but now they live in Nebuchadnezzar's house. They were people who knew what it meant to live in Israel and to practice the Sabbath keeping and the laws of Israel's own holy, sacred life. But now, suddenly, they're in a completely different context, assimilated with pressures on every side, asking them to conform, demanding that they fit the script of Nebuchadnezzar's world. It's worth our just pausing, I think, to acknowledge that this is part of why I want to suggest that we live in a time where we need to take seriously that our life is more like living in exile than it is like living in Promised Land. In the Promised Land, we are the controlling influence. In an assimilationist world of being called to live as exiles, we are affected by all of the surrounding forces that are at play. We grow up in those forces in our family. We experience them in our schooling. We experience them in our friendships as they gradually extend out beyond our initial home to all of the people that we come to know. We begin to be aware at early ages and throughout our whole life of all the various forces that are at play, shaping our life, giving us language, giving us values, giving us priorities, giving us the capacity to be able to see and entertain the world in the way that we do. We are all dependent on that kind of assimilation. This is what any kind of culture does. So we've all arrayed ourselves here this morning, largely dressed all in the same way, except for me. And having not assimilated to Jackson whole life, I'm the only person in the room wearing a tie. So by next week, I will have assimilated more to Jackson whole life. I will have taken off my tie. I will have realized that really this is a different kind of culture. It's fine to come to church without a tie. In Berkeley, when I was the pastor, we just hoped people would come with clothing, really. We just wanted them to come dressed. That was all that we hoped for in a place like Berkeley. But we understand all of these subtle and sometimes not so subtle cues that indicate to us exactly where we are, how we should behave, what we should say, what we should do. A lot of those things are relatively neutral. But many of those things are things that also bear values, statements about what matters and what doesn't matter. I think of a young friend of mine who told me as a little boy, when we were two little guys growing up in the same place, and he would say, his mom would take his face in his hands every morning before they went to church, or to school rather, and she'd say, now remember today at school that you are a miller. And every day, his mom loved to reinforce this. Now that, in one sense, had its own messaging, but as he got older, he realized that being a miller was not exactly a neutral thing, nor was it even really a healthy thing. So to be a miller and to remember that you were a miller, it's not a neutral fact. He was being, in that sense, assimilated to the family culture, which had its life and its gifts, but it definitely also had its travails and its problems and its distortions. None of us live in a world where we have assimilated to a world that's neutral. Google depends on the fact that at 1,000, if not millions of data points, our lives can be affected and surrendered and given over to people whose names we do not know, to an industry that we don't want to necessarily fully admit is affecting and forcing us in the way that it is, to think and respond and engage in our neighbors and the world around us in the way that it actually does. Social media intensifies all of those kinds of assimilation, but we experience it whether we're experiencing it technologically or in other terms, we are experiencing in ways that shape us and form us. The question that this text is asking, in a world where we are being shaped by a world around us, how do we remember that our identity is not about those forces? Certainly that was what was on the line for Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But what's really on the line for them is to say, even though we live in Nebuchadnezzar's house, we need to remember that we belong to Yahweh. And so early on in their time, they say they go to Nebuchadnezzar's officials, Ashpenaz, who's the keeper of the house, and they basically strike a deal. They say, we will enter into all of this, but we would like to be able to practice our own dietary law. They set a test. They say, look, we're not interested in risking your life, which he explains that he doesn't want to lose his head over their change of diet. So they just express to them that, no, really, let's set a 10-day test. Allow us to eat according to our dietary law, and if in 10 days you measure us and find us wanting, then that will be different. But if we're not found wanting, then allow us to continue to eat in the same way that we believe that as people who belong to Yahweh, that we are called to do. They set the test goes well, they come back, and they're as healthy or healthier than anyone else. And in the context, what this early chapter in Daniel is saying is, in the middle of all the forces of assimilation, how will we remember who we are? This is the question of exilic life. How do we remember, and then how do we practice who we are? It's interesting in this case, it's not just that they set a script, we belong to Yahweh, though we live in Nebuchadnezzar's house. No, it was manifested in a physical way. Every time they ate, they said, this food tells us that we belong to Yahweh and not to Nebuchadnezzar. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what is it that is shaping our lives and our identity most profoundly? Perhaps it's voices, it might have been from long ago, parents or grandparents or early bosses or teachers that may have affected us. People that have shaped us and told us who we are. Is it true or is it not true? Is it partially true but also partially distorted? Who do we understand ourselves to be? In a world of so much assimilation, are we clear as people who belong to Jesus Christ, as people who confess to believe in the one true and living God? Is it true that we have practiced and remembered our identity in the midst of a competing sea of values and priorities? See, the challenge that's in this text is really such a plain one. What will we do? What do we do that tells us who we are? A number of years ago, I was speaking at an event that had such bright lights on the stage that I could see almost no one that I was talking to. What I could see was, on this side of the stage, a really large video monitor that had an image of me. And then on the other side of the stage, there was another large video monitor that had another image of me. And then there was me. So there was me and me and me. I thought, this is sort of the postmodern Trinity. This is the world I was made for, where everyone and everything is totally aligned around the things that matter most to me, namely me. That's the cultivated culture into which I was born and where you and I live every single day. Who are you? It's what I choose to be. It's what I want to be. It's what I can make myself to be. It's all about my own initiative and capacity, and that is ultimately what the Bible says will lead to death. That's why this issue of identity is so critical. Here, what's happening in this text is Daniel and his friends are overwhelmed by Nebuchadnezzar's power and rage. We'll see that even more next week. And in the context of this, the question is, how do we remember who we are? When competing voices, things that are right and things that are wrong in us and around us, are trying to argue and defend and shove us in various directions, do we understand who we really are? I remember a man who came to my door as a pastor one day who basically in about 30 seconds said, I'm really successful, I'm really powerful, I have a lot of money, and I really don't want to have this conversation, but could I have 5 minutes of your time? I said, wow, that's quite a self-introduction. He had a script down. He knew who he was. He was going to declare who he was. He wanted to tell me who he was. And he wanted me to relate to him in that particular way. He said, you know, my wife comes to this church and she talks about Jesus. I don't really know anything about Jesus. And so I thought maybe I could come by for some quick bullet points about Jesus. I said, well, that's unfortunate, really, because for one thing, I'm not very good with bullet points, so that's not going to get you very far. And if I did tell you about Jesus, and if you did understand the bullet points, they could have a way of working their way into your life, and you'd have to rethink your power and your money and your success. And I just don't really have the feeling that you're interested in doing that. Oh, I'm totally not interested in doing that, he said. Exactly. I said, so why don't we just brainstorm? If she brings up Jesus, how do you move the conversation from Jesus to baseball or whatever it is that you're interested in talking about? He said, no, I'm really serious. I said, oh, so am I. I mean, I'm not sure that I really want to mess with your life when it's really quite clear that you're very content, except for dinner. Now, that was the beginning of a long set of conversations, but we all have those places, do we not? Where we know who we think we are, where we encounter the Christian faith that really says, no, let me now tell you who you actually are. Not because of your checkbook or because of your success or your failure, not because of your beauty or your lack of it, not because of your health or your ill health, not because you get to live in Jackson Hole or you don't, not because everything in your life is going well or because it's not, or because you have troubles in your own life or that you see the troubles and issues in our culture and society. No, let me tell you who you are. You are a person made in the image of God, of exceeding great value, who is knit together in your mother's womb, whose nuances and subtleties of life are known by the God who fashioned you and created you. A God who wants to share life with you, a God who sees you, who knows your name, who has seen and been attentive to everything that has ever happened to you. A God who wants to press toward you, not to press in on you in a way that coerces you, but to let you know that you are known and seen and loved. That you're forgiven where you need forgiveness, that you are a person so valuable that this God wants to love and remake us. And then to call us into an unlikely community of other people known as the body of Christ. To be people who live as light and salt in the world, who give evidence in a world of assimilation that there is light, that there is truth, that there is life that exceeds the brawl of assimilation that goes on around us. And I want you for myself. I want you in communion because I want to give you my very life. In a few moments, we're going to come to this table. This table, which is for the people of God, the church, the table where we, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, like Daniel and his friends, eat a meal that actually reminds us of who we are. Who are we? We're the people who have discovered that there's a God who would love us like this, who would give us his body and his blood, who would do this radical act of mercy and grace, because he knows that we're people who find assimilation our instinct, and it will mean ultimately our death. And instead, what we're offered is a table that is nothing less than the table of life. So we'll invite you to eat and drink with thanksgiving, because whether we find ourselves yielded and happily knowing all of our value as a follower of Jesus, or whether we're feeling today perhaps estranged, we're not even entirely sure why we're here this morning, this table speaks of a God who knows your name, who loves you, who wants you to feed and eat and practice eating in a way that will help you remember who you really are. You've been made and found and loved. And here you are fed for the journey of life and the journey of faith that is before you today and this week and in the time to come. So in this opening chapter, we're told that what does faithful exilic life look like? It looks like people who, in the midst of a teeming sea of assimilating forces, have discovered and remembered to practice their identity. That's my call to you. That's the gift of this table. May we eat and drink with thanksgiving.